Elite Facts presents
8 Historical Criminal Shootouts. 8. John Paul Chase. John Paul Chase was associated with just about every famous underworld figure of the Prohibition era. Chase's track record was quite impressive, as he was a member of Alvin Karpus's and Ma Barker's gang, was an associate of George Babyface Nelson, and eventually became a member of John Dillinger's gang, one of the most notorious gangsters of that era next to Al Capone. Chase miraculously survived the shootout that killed Nelson, which in turn made Chase one of the longest-serving inmates at Alcatraz. After Dillinger and associate Homer Van Meter were killed by the FBI during the late summer of 1934, Chase and Nelson jumped around the country for a while looking for a safe place. Unfortunately for them, they were unable to find anywhere safe. The pair were then ambushed by federal agents in Illinois in November of 1934. Nelson was killed in the ensuing gunfight, but Chase escaped. This didn't sit well with Nelson's widow, Helen, as soon after the shootout she gave Chase's name to the feds, who until then had not known who they were even looking for. He was sentenced in March of 1935 and served 31 years in prison.
7.
The Fleagle Gang. Yet another gang of outlaws from the Prohibition era makes the list, as the Fleagle Gang, consisting of brothers Jake and Ralph, along with Howard Royston and George Abshire, were infamous for robbing banks. The gang was active for well over 10 years and is said to have gotten away with over $1 million, which by today's standards is somewhere around $10 million. Yeah, that is crazy. After robbing a bank in Lamar, Colorado in 1928, the gang became the first case in which a conviction was based on fingerprint evidence. The robbery took an almost instant nosedive as the bank's president managed to duck into his office and grab a .45 caliber gun. As you'd expect, chaos ensued, which resulted in casualties. Howard Royston got shot in the jaw, and several bank employees were killed in the process, including the bank's president and his son. They were able to escape to a Kansas farm owned by Jake, but were understandably forced to seek out a doctor for Royston's wound.
6.
George Anderson and Gerald Chapman. In 1919, George Dutch Anderson and Gerald Chapman were paroled from Auburn State Prison. It was in that prison that these two decided to become partners. The two men formed one of the earliest Prohibition-era criminal gangs, specializing in bootlegging, counterfeiting, and robbery. Gerald Chapman was the first criminal to be labeled Public Enemy Number 1, and Anderson met his end in a gruesomely dramatic shootout in 1925 in which both participants died. Chapman was turned in by an informant in January of 1925 and sentenced to death for the killing of a cop. Although law enforcement had no idea where Anderson was, his involvement was suspected when the informant who gave his name up to the police and his wife were found dead several months later. In October of the same year of his disappearance, his counterfeit currency was traced to Muskegon, Michigan. Local law enforcement of Muskegon eventually discovered his location. Officer Charles Hammond confronted Anderson about a counterfeit bill he had passed at a cafe. Not certain that the man he had in his custody was Anderson, Hammond wasn't prepared when the gun came out in an alley next to City Hall. Anderson fired 2 wild shots, fled for a short distance with the officer pursuing, then managed to hit Hammond in the chest. Hammond proceeded to wrestle the gun from Anderson and shoot him in the heart with it, at which point both men collapsed. Anderson died at the scene. Hammond died at a hospital.
5.
James Oklahoma Jack Clark. James Oklahoma Jack Clark was a member of the Lamb Gang, a gang run by Herman Baron Lamb, a pioneering bank robber whose techniques were studied by the previously mentioned gangster John Dillinger. Following what would be a legendary bank robbery, Clark and a fellow gangster survived a massive shootout in 1930. By that time, bank holdups were becoming increasingly common, and the newly formed FBI didn't exactly have a blueprint for dealing with crimes of this nature. In Indiana, police decided to band together groups of vigilantes to keep an eye on banks within the state. One of these men, a local barber, came to investigate the presence of 4 strange men at the bank armed with a shotgun, just as the robbers returned to the getaway car. Unfortunately for the group of robbers, the driver panicked and made a U-turn, which swung the vehicle to the point where it blew one of the tires, leading to an outrageous string of automotive bad luck. The next car they grabbed had a governor installed and chugged along at a fraction of its normal maximum speed. Deciding this vehicle wasn't fit for their getaway, they ditched it for a truck with a radiator that was dry as a bone. It soon began blowing steam and overheating. So they jacked yet another car, which only had 1 gallon of gas in the tank. Thanks to the many delays they had with vehicles, this allowed a couple of hundred heavily armed police and vigilantes to catch up with them, and as you'd expect, an extremely one-sided firefight ensued. Clark and fellow gang member Walter Dietrich surrendered, and Clark spent the rest of his life in prison.
4,
Larry Phillips and Emile Matta Serrano. So oddly enough, this shootout was completely inspired by the epic shootout scene from the 1995 film Heat. Larry Phillips and Emile Matta Serrano attempted to rob the North Hollywood Bank of America in February of 1997. These two men were heavily armed with fully automatic AK-47s, homemade body armor, and medication known as phenobarbital to calm their nerves. To hide their identities, they put on their ski masks and entered the bank at 9:17 a.m. The shootout between the robbers and the police took 44 minutes and resulted in casualties, including 10 police officers and 7 civilians seriously wounded. In the end, however, the two robbers were gunned down by police reinforcements despite having heavier artillery.
3,
California Security Bank. On May 9, 1980, 5 armed robbers stormed a Security Pacific Bank in Norco, California, where they would take around $20,000. Unfortunately for them, they were almost instantly spotted by a teller at a bank across the street, who took it upon himself to call for help. Armed with assault rifles, handguns, shotguns, pipe bombs, and hollow point ammunition, they engaged Deputy Glenn Bolaski in a shootout where he sustained serious injuries to his face, forearms, left elbow, and left shoulder. They were also involved in a car chase which resulted in the destruction of 33 police cruisers and civilian cars, and a shot-down helicopter. The result of the chase saw the death of an officer as well as injuries to 2 others. The robbers fled with 1 fatality, while another was killed in a shootout the next day, and the rest were later arrested.
2,
Jules Bonnet. When 3 police officers confronted anarchist Jules Bonnet in an apartment in April of 1912, he almost instantly opened fire, killing the vice chief of the Sécurité Nationale before fleeing across rooftops. Because of this crime, he had become France's most wanted criminal with a reward of 100,000 francs. On April 28th, he was cornered in a Paris suburb, and the shootout ended with the police bombing the building where Bonnet was taking cover.
1,
Marvin and Blanche Barrow. Although Bonnie and Clyde's 1934 ambush by police is iconic, a shootout a year earlier not only makes the Bonnie and Clyde ambush seem minor in comparison, but also marked the beginning of the end for the gang. In July of 1933, Bonnie, Clyde, Buck, and Blanche, and an outside associate named W.D. Jones were tracked and engaged by police in Platte City, Missouri twice over the course of 5 days. While Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones escaped, Buck and Blanche were captured by law enforcement. Buck died from his wounds, and Blanche survived to serve 6 years in prison. She served her time and was released in 1940 and died of cancer in 1988 at the age of 77.
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more elite facts.